So conflicts of interest in this setting, these are the Emory policies that can be found on the intranet. They actually read pretty easily, and they are pretty clear about what we can and can't do as far as engaging in a relationship with a funding partner who has a business interest. The University Institutional Conflict of Interest Review Committee, if anyone doesn't realize that that committee exists, it does. It reviews and reports to the Vice President for Research Administration, the same doctor that we stole the slide from earlier. Most of these things are caught at the level of the IRB, meaning that when you apply for IRB approval to engage in one of these studies, if it looks at all like there's a gray area and you may have some financial benefit, or the institution may have some financial benefit that's in a conflict with the outcome of the research, it'll be diverted to this conflict of interest review committee and then back to you. But at the end of the day, it's up to the investigator to be educated and to realize that these gray areas exist. For example, this is a picture of IVC filters, and the take-home point, well, I hope the take-home point is that they are all very similar, and so they all have very comparable efficacies. And so as investigators on the clinical side, we have to be careful of saying that because AngioDynamics has funded our study, then we drop an AngioDynamics filter in every patient who comes across. Whether that's explicit or not, it certainly creates the perception of a conflict of interest. And so it's something as an investigator to be very careful about and not to create that perception.
And you just gave the key word, which is perception.
Right.
I sat on the Conflict of Interest Committee in Arizona, and that was always the key thing, that even if we could decide that there's no conflict of interest, but we would keep saying, but what if somebody from the newspaper were to get a hold of this and say that it's sometimes just the perception of conflict of interest will get you in trouble. So. And
this is, I think, probably the most dicey area for us.
It's hard.
Because the motivation of the company to fund our research, and I'll talk about that more later, is often to create relationships so that in the end, especially here at Emory, we're such a huge department that they want us to use their products. And so, you know, without oversimplifying, I think you really have to you have to purposely put a different filter in. Not all the time, but here and there, just to be sure that you're not feeding into that perception. And then your disclosures, anything that you present at your society or elsewhere, of course, we have to make the point that the study was funded by industry. So who owns the data? In the multi-center trial example, the company owns the data. They are going to report it, and they're going to line edit anything that you write, and they have the ultimate decision as to whether or not this thing gets published. And so being the PI on a multi-center trial, then you really sort of bear that risk. If it doesn't shake out the way they want it to, then you may have wasted your time other than bringing some cases into the institution. So when you negotiate an investigator-initiated, industry-funded trial, you have to be very careful and very sure that your contract or what you agree to is explicit about who decides where and what is going to be published at the end. And so ultimately, what I've been able to negotiate is that they will have a line in the contract that says they get to review anything that I write before I submit it for publication. And that's kind of the end of it. So I guess at least they have a heads up if it comes out some way that they didn't want. And either way, even if they own the intellectual property and they own everything about a multi-center trial or even a single investigator trial, in order for them to translate this information into intellectual property and money for them, they still have to go through you. Which again, I think the best example is Dr. Dudzak is on the CPT. You are still on this just rotated off at the American Medical Association CPT editorial committee. And so the point being that all of these things have to be translated through science or through clinicians in order to become reimbursable entities in the end. So the company can never sort of do anything without you, to put it simply. And then Dr. Krupinski mentioned this early on, and that is that the proposals or the mechanism to the actual money and the return on investment are a little bit different when you're talking about industry when compared to pure green grant money. And the process is really comparable to the startup process that we talk so much about here at Emory, and that is that you've got to search immediately when you think you have an idea, search for companies who are in the right space, search for companies who may be trying to accomplish something similar or the same thing that you're trying to accomplish. This is where MD, PhD collaboration is really important, because most of the time, or many times, the basic science research side has a solution for the problem that you are thinking about. And so that collaboration can be important. And then the company will ask you, as they will with a startup company, why should we invest in your startup company? Why should we invest in your idea? And you've got to have an answer for that. And most of the time, that answer is going to be given in a venue like this. Most of the time, as opposed to generating a grant proposal and submitting it to somebody for review, you're going to sit around a table like this and sort of pitch your idea prospectively before any pen goes to paper. And then what have you done so far? So with the startup company, they want to know, have you made money? Do you have proof of concept of whatever it is that you think is fundable? So the idea here, the proof of concept isn't necessarily that your idea needs proven. That's usually the topic of the study, but rather you've proven that you can run a study. So when you sit down with these, because especially doctors will go to companies all the time, I have this great idea, why don't we do this? Why don't you give me $1 million? And so they'll sit on the other side of that and not really question whether or not your idea is going to work, but whether or not you have the infrastructure and experience to run the trial, because they don't want to give you the $1 million and then you don't know what you're doing or where the IRB is, and everybody wastes their time. And again, back to the multi-center trials, if you've participated with them in the past or any other company in the past, they at least know that you can run something through an IRB, recruit patients, and get something done. And you'll tell them all of this around a table, after which they will give you something like this. Halyard is a company that makes radiofrequency ablation probes, among other things. And I've sort of gone through this process with them, so I wanted to put it up here as a real-world example. I sat down with a Halyard rep and said, I've got an idea. I didn't tell them what it was. Have an idea for an application of your technology, and then we go through the NDA process and sit around this table, tell them the idea, and if they're interested, then they generate this. Because the reality is these are usually non-scientific business folks. And so if you take the time to generate a grant in response to this, they're not going to understand it. So this becomes a formality at the end of the day. It's more along the lines of the startup company, where they want to invest in you, the investigator, and then whatever you write here, I'm not sure if they ultimately see it or not. A real-world example, what I think is a good example, this is Cliff Weiss from Johns Hopkins, and he's sort of my interventional radiology hero, because he was able to go through this and do basic science experiments where they embolized the gastric artery. They embolized the left gastric artery, now being called the bariatric artery, for the treatment of obesity. And he did exactly what we just discussed. He approached industry. I think the particles, the people who make the particles for the embolizations that we do every day or do quite often for other reasons, and said, I have a new great idea for use of your particles. They agreed, fund his basic science work, and now he's running a very famous multi-center trial. He's got 2 R01s, I believe. And so he was able to translate that early money into ultimately NIH money in time. So that's a real-world example of where this process works and can be valuable for us. So lastly, the return on investment, or the win, as the companies like to call it. So I have a caution. You can imagine I've got this sort of caution. So you have to be careful about the win, or you have to be careful about what the company thinks is a win. For some of the reasons that we talked about before, but really for the reasons up here. So their motivation is to create relationships, which I guess is okay as long as you don't let them buy you coffee and so forth. You can keep your relationships and talk to them about it. Their motivation is marketing. So when you conduct an industry-sponsored trial and then you go to your national meeting and present the results, their logo is usually on your poster or on your slides, and you add their disclosure. Again, all above the board and okay, as long as you realize that this is their motivation. Their publications carry the same weight for them. Your publications carry the same weight for them. They get data, which I think is least important to them. And then downstream effects. The downstream effects of an investigator-initiated industry-sponsored trial is usually the opening of doors. If you think about the idea that Cliff had with particles for embolization, and the doors that I've opened up downstream are interventional radiology applications for the treatment of obesity, a huge market. And so downstream effects, usually businessmen and women are good about that, realizing that the downstream effects, they don't see them yet. But they're good about going in blind and counting on that downstream effect. For us, the win really is the data, right? We want the data because we started the whole talk about getting after that green money and using that prelim data for our larger grant applications to government agencies and other sort of pure sources of money in order to parlay it into programmatic research and expansion of our ideas. Get our own, fund our own lab, which will feed back preliminary data to future grant applications. It kind of kickstarts our mechanism toward our time here in the Ivory Tower and then potentially out into the world with our own Google products. And then to do good. At the end of the day, that's what we all hope to do, I think. So that's all I have for that. If anyone has
switch over, yes,
questions.
More questions.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Just a couple of comments and some additional things. Again, from the writing perspective, and you showed a really good illustration of in a sense, what the grant looks like. The grant or the proposal is, 10 pages of them and their contract and 1 page of you sometimes. And it's more of a statement of work than a proposal, because you've already gone through all those steps that you talked about, which is you've sat around the table, you've discussed, and so on. And again, I have a lot of industry contracts as well. And again, a lot of it's this around the table talking about stuff with the NDAs in place and all of that. The contracts and so on really are between the lawyers. You can kind of try to get your say in there sometimes, but usually it's between their lawyers and Emory lawyers. And things like the publications and so on, Emory will argue for you. And you can, you go read through the contracts and you'll say, no, I don't like this point. Can you help me, negotiate this better? But a lot of the times, these are straight legalese on some of those. And then the writing part literally is, more often than not, at least the ones I've done, more of a statement of work. And it's literally, more bullets. There's not a lot of paragraphs. There's none of this intro and background that we've talked about. There's none of, it's a little bit of preliminary data sometimes. But it's more, here's what I'm going to do. And sometimes it's as brief as a bulleted list with a timeline. And the key things with contracts really, as you noted, is time. NIH, you got your 5 years, and oh, you can kind of do this, and oh, I'll wait till the very last minute. With contracts, you say it's 3 months, it's 3 months. And if you don't do it, they can come after you and sue you, and the university and everybody else. And nobody's going to like that. So you're really going to have to pay attention. Some things that are useful just to follow up on the OTT, the Office of Protect Transfer. Here are their websites. There's one just strict overall, and then there's one specifically for inventors and contracts and so on. Again, they'll handle all the agreements that you have as opposed to the Office for Sponsored Projects, who does your grants. They handle all industry corporate contracts and agreement. They handle the STTRs and SBIRs, subcontracts under industry grants, as well as any outgoing subcontracts that you may have. So you may actually have on one of your grants a company. They'll also deal with that as well. Everything does still go through pre-award though, as David mentioned. So, even contracts will go there. And it's divided up, again, Todd Schurz is the Associate VP, but they also have licensing, industry contracting. The patent group is in there as well, plus their finance section. So, they have a lot of stuff there. And again, here's their website. But what's also useful, this is a different page. This is the page on the policies. And so if you want to know about some of the policies and so on, you can go to this page and find out some of the information. And there's guidelines and all that other stuff. It can be pretty dry reading, but if you do have questions, it's always better to kind of look at this first and then go ask them to follow up with questions and so on. And they do have the disclosure forms here as well, which can be very important. A lot of the times, you have to protect yourself when you're talking about your ideas, but a lot of times companies kind of coming to you as well, and they will send you and ask you to sign an NDA. Here you can't do that. At Arizona I could. Here Emory has to sign it. So you have to go through one of these offices and one of these links. So if a company sends you an NDA, sometimes they're called CDAs, there's a couple of names for them, but basically they're disclosure agreements, confidential disclosure, these are non-disclosure. You cannot sign it. It's not binding. So you have to go through one of these. Mostly Chantrell Lowe is the one that I've gone through to work with industry. But sometimes you'll have foundations or nonprofits, clinical trials, and so on. If you're doing outside consulting, that's Zainab Harvey. And these are circumstances where, again, you got to worry about the whole conflict of interest, and you have to go through the conflict of interest process. But for example, a company may approach you and say, well, can we just hire you as a consultant? We don't want you to really do any work, but we want your advice on some of these things. Emory may or may not allow it, because what that means is they're going to pay you as an individual at home. And I've had a couple that I sent through here. One they told me was okay. It was simply doing lit reviews and writing papers on a topic sort of related but no real research. That one they let me do. Another one where I'm the editor for a journal, they wouldn't let me do it. I had to do that through Emory, and the money has to come through Emory. Rhyme or reason, who knows? But there are offices that can help you with all of this, with signing and with language and contracts and so on. Again, with the indirect costs, you have to notify them up front. And people tend to not think of these industry contract budgets in the same way as they would in NIH, but you do have to. So think about the equipment that you're going to need. Think about the supplies that you're going to need. Think of it, especially if you're, the types of things you're talking about, which are clinical trials. Are you going to need a study coordinator? Are you going to need a nurse? Above and beyond what they're saying here, we'll just pay for this, sometimes they don't realize what it takes to do a study. Also, sometimes, not so much for the clinical trials, well, sometimes, I've considered, and I've worked into some of my contracts, a trade for salary for equipment. So I'm working on one right now with Barco, where they want me to do some psychophysical studies. And they came and they said, well, we'll pay for the subject pay, but we'd rather not pay your salary. I said, okay, well, what do you got to do something. They said, what if we were to give you a brand new 8 megapixel color medical grade monitor? I said, okay. And it's worth more than because I was going to ask them for $10,000. That monitor is worth about $50,000. I have to use it in the study. I get to keep it. They provide a computer as well. So, but then I had to go through OTT and the contracting and say, can we do this here? They said yes. So, it's good. So I'm going to get a $50,000 monitor that I can use in any future studies. So every now and then it's worth considering that as well. Sometimes with the more medical, you may be able to get other equipment out of them. So you're testing this, oh, but they also make that. Well, could we do that? And I'd love to play around with that or whatever. The thing you have to worry about is getting stuff for free. When I was on the Conflict of Interest Committee at Arizona, we had one of our surgeons who was getting these skin meshes for free because he happened to perform surgery on a patient who owned this company, saved his life, oh, here, let me give you these things. And then he started to use them, and it's like, oh, wait, no, don't be doing that, and got all sorts of trouble. Also, review your payment terms. Is it a half upfront? Is it a third? Do you only get money after you've given them some sort of report? So find out and make sure you're okay with those payment terms. And here at Emory, given the post-award situation and how screwed up they are, periodically check that those companies are being invoiced and received. We recently had an issue here in the department where a bunch of work was being done. Emory was sending out the invoices, but it wasn't until the third one, 3 quarters later, so 9 months later, somebody said, oh, no, the PI checked in. They hadn't been getting any money. Invoices were going out, but our offices were not telling anybody that, oh, they're not paying over $100,000 in the hole, and now we're having to deal with it. So periodically check with post-award to make sure that you are getting paid. So now we'll kind of open it up to broad questions. Again, in terms of writing and so on, it is very different. It's a very different mentality and so on. You know, we've both kind of done different types of contracts, clinical trials versus more basic research. Different beast, but, you know, I agree it's a really good bridging mechanisms, because eventually sometimes, like on a lot of mine, I've translated these into NIH grants with the companies. So they're either the lead if they're a small company, or I'm the lead and I put them on as a subcontract, and they tend to look really, you know, good, and we take our preliminary data and we move forward.
Right. It's very valuable. Early on, I was reluctant to engage in any study with industry. I was worried about the conflict of interest. I was worried about presenting the results and the audience thinking that I was sort of a puppet for the company. And I really did waste time because I worried about that, because at the end of the day, their money will get you the preliminary data that you want. So it's worth it. Yep. Just because it's so hard to get, you know, money for prelim data. So I did waste time because I tried to avoid that, and I only wanted pure. But you can't just walk in the door and get pure
exactly.
money. So,
it doesn't work
so
that
it's
way.
a good stepping stone.
Right. And as long as you disclose, I mean, and that's the whole conflict of interest and disclosure, that is really all they care about, as long as you disclose. And sometimes you have to put that on the consent forms. So as it's going through IRB, because sometimes there's the one that catch it, so you may have to put on a consent form, especially if it's with patients, that this company and the PI are funded in part by this company. And as long as it's there in the consent form, and then it is required that when you make presentations, when you put papers, there's an acknowledgement section, you simply say, this work was supported by or in part by Barco or whoever the company is. And that's usually adequate to get around all these issues. You know, just as long as you're, just be open and honest, basically.
Right.
You know, don't try to hide the relationship.
Right, agreed.
And every now and then, now there are some companies that will ask that somebody from their company becomes an author. And that is partly in the negotiating, but partly your judgment as the PI in a sense. I've allowed it sometimes when the person from the company clearly did all the developmental work, clearly contributed to part of the design of the study, where, you know, where I felt that they deserved part of it. They provided part of the paper, they gave feedback, and so on. So that's kind of a tricky issue as well, is, you know, when do you include them as authors, because that then is saying something else about the sponsorship of the work.
Right. So it's important to define from an academic standpoint what you're going to be able to do independently when this is over.
Right. Questions?